Chairman, we're going to now resume the audit committee, and there are a couple of things I need to bring to the board's attention. Is that if you look inside your packet, you actually have copies of the presentation that Rick has gone through thus far, and it's actually behind the student affairs material because that was our original spot. Unfortunately, these materials were just recently added to the portal, so you probably didn't know to look back at this particular link in order to get them. So if you look to the information right behind student affairs, you can see the presentation. And Rick, oh, there you are. Okay, great. So as we discussed, Rick, if you wouldn't mind go ahead and kind of going, particularly since the members have copies of the slides, if you wouldn't mind kind of doing things based upon categories, that'd be good.
All right.
And then just to kind of as our next steps, the chair of the audit committee for the Board of Trustees of Florida A&M, Mr. Carl White, is here, and he's asked for an opportunity to come in and give the board perspective following the information we've received from Rick. And from there, if I could have the committees wait and just save their questions after the presentation from Mr. White, I think that'd be the most efficient way to handle the rest of our meeting. So, Rick, you want to go ahead?
All right, sure. The next category has to do with the subrecipient monitoring, and basically it had to do with needed policies and procedures over this area. One of the primary things that was noted was that the university was not adequately following up on the findings of the audit reports from the subrecipients, and we have implemented procedures with the sponsor research responsible for monitoring and being sure that we are receiving the reports, and then the Division of Audit and Compliance will be responsible for following up to be sure that adequate corrective actions is taken. We also had a finding related to the contracts and grants that found where there were a couple of areas that could be improved. Again, dealing with the procedures over a number of areas, and there's also noted that there was an expenditure that was not properly approved. The next area is insurance coverage on buildings. Primarily, the emphasis here was there was not a documented approval of the certificate of insurance that was sent to the state to obtain the coverage, and that also there was not an adequate reconciliation process to be sure that additions and disposals got added timely to the schedule that was sent to the state. And then lastly, they were on the investigations area. They had a number of findings that had to deal with the investigations were not adequately documented. Certain things that should have been in the work papers were not in the work papers. And again, that the policies and procedures were not adequate to cover the conduct of the investigations. And consequently, the university has implemented procedures. We adopted a procedures manual in May 2012 that is currently being used. We've also began tracking all complaints through our hotline. That provides us some control over that process. And with that, I will turn it over to Trustee White for any questions.
Welcome, Mr. White.
Thank you. And for the record, I don't think he's going to get off quite that easy turning it over to me for questions. I wanted to speak with you and provide you with sort of an overview as well from the board standpoint. You know, the audit committee, and particularly the audit function, goes through and to identify the things, you know, that have happened in a very, you know, sort of formal and audit-esque way. In a simple analysis, though, I would say that the problems fall into sort of one of three categories. There are issues where there are opportunities to improve the policies. There are opportunities to make sure that the policies are appropriately adhered to, and then the third category would be there are issues where things can be automated and we need to make more investments in technology. So the board having acknowledged, these things coming through this report, I can tell you that, one of the major, issues there would be the bank reconciliation. And so what the report acknowledged was that we needed to look at both automation and making sure that the staff in place have the appropriate training. And so we have taken this opportunity, since we had to retain Ernst & Young to do this work anyway. We have begun working with them in helping us identify opportunities to facilitate reconciliation, and actually there are a couple of other areas that they're working with the university to make sure that we, in fact, have deal with the first area of improvement in the policies, to make sure that the appropriate policies and the most state-of-the-art policies are in place sort of across the institution. I can also say that, from the board standpoint, we have also scheduled to have Ernst & Young provide some additional audit committee training for the audit committee itself. And I believe that that's actually scheduled to take place, at the next meeting. The other big area that was cited in the Ernst & Young report was, the athletics, area. And so at the last Budget and Finance Committee meeting, we made the specific request, and I made the specific request that our athletic director make sure that he speaks with Florida State, since they're in our town, and also with our other counterparts, to make sure that we are aware of and are implementing the best policies. The other areas that were identified tend to fall into the category of policies that were often not necessarily adhered to, even though they were properly in place. And so one of the things that the board also made the request of President Robinson at the last meeting was to come back to us with a more in-depth report on how it is that we can make sure that the training also gets properly done. One of the things that came up in a previous report actually had to do with an investigation around the spending of SGA funds, and one of the things that we then were able to work out with both the office of the office of the CFO and with the student government was an understanding that the training needed to take place each year for the students, particularly since the fact that you have new people taking in these positions, each year. So, from a high level standpoint, from the board standpoint, we just want to make sure that we communicate to you that we understand, sort of where we have a good idea about where these issues are occurring, and that we have charged ourselves both at the board level and specifically with President Robinson to implement a very thorough corrective set of actions around each of the areas identified.
Thank you, Mr. White. Are there any questions from members of the board? Governor Kuntz?
Mr. White, I know you, or I suspect you would agree, and we would all agree that the audit was pretty sobering. A lot of issues, and I might have missed this as we were transitioning, as the governor was coming in and leaving, so I apologize if this was said. It sounds like a lot of issues. Sounds like there's a remediation plan for each of these issues. What I'm curious about, so we would have thought, you would have thought probably that there were policies and processes in place to begin with that would have not allowed these things to happen. What is the board, what is the plan to make sure not only that there are policies and procedures, but to actually circle back and make sure that it's working? That these problems have been fixed. I guess my question is there certain time-specific dates that somebody can go back and recheck and be certain that everything looks better?
we're trying to get to the point where we have a set of realistic sort of deliverables. One of I would say the big issue there that at least struck me was the bank reconciliation, area. And what the report actually showed was that there was, in fact, a set of policies, sort of in place, and then over time, people fell off in terms of practice. Now, and so I think the solution is both one of having the right policy in place, but quite frankly, also having the right people in place and ensuring that the training continues to occur. And so, I think from a board standpoint, our responsibility is to make sure that there's an appropriate level of accountability between us and the president about how these things actually occur. Now, the other issue as it relates to the timing piece is the Ernst & Young report also pointed out that our process is unusually manual. And so in that regard, we also understand that we have to make some technology investments as well related to PeopleSoft and the others. And so that's one where we're trying to get to a point where we have a definitive date, but I don't have that date right now.
I would just suggest that the committee may want to work with President Robinson to establish some dates. If you don't hit the date, or if the school doesn't hit the date, well, you can always go back and find out why. But until such time as there's some date certain, at this date, this should have been done, and this is how we'll know it's been done, and we'll go back and have checked it, then I worry that you could actually have slippage and not quite get there. So, President, I just would offer that up as a suggestion.
Thank you.
Governor Hussaini?
This is my opportunity to talk to a Board of Trustee members. And,
I have a flight. No, I'm just-
last time when Dr. Robinson brought us the work plan, the new work plan, and I mentioned it to him that I was proud of what he's presenting to us. It was very workable, realistic. But the work plan before that was given to us was disaster. There should be accountability among the Board of Trustees. You as a trustee we trust the Board of Trustees of each university to look at the work plans and to look at what the president does. And when it comes to us, that we know is already being looked at by Board of Trustees. And it really needs to be a way of a Board of Trustees to look at all the work plans and question its president, because I know that if that your Board of Trustees would have looked at that work plan while all this stuff was going on, you would not have agreed and let the previous president to bring that work plan to us. Any comment?
No. Well said. Point well taken.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
I'm not on your committee, but I have spent a couple hours with President Robinson last week in anticipation of this, and Carl White and I've talked on the phone not about this, but he's also, as if he doesn't have enough to do, chairing their presidential search committee. So he's, and he lives in Boston, I think, and has been dealing with the weather, and so, they're putting in a lot of time, and I'm impressed by what President Robinson his commitment to getting this done. I have suggested, and I think they're going to do this, is that they ask Ernst & Young, or whomever they choose, but since Ernst & Young engaged, to come back in 6 months and say, the work's been, what we suggested has been completed, or is a process. So we can get a report back that provides us and the board with the comfort level that we all feel. I'm reminded by something that a very smart friend of mine once said to me, and he said, the dumbest administration can fool the smartest volunteer board. And I'm not suggesting that you're the smartest volunteer board or you had a dumb administration, but I'm suggesting that we can't do this. We need to have processes in place, and we can be, ultimately, we have to rely on our presidents to get this work done. And I'm impressed by what I've seen so far, President Robinson's commitment to this, and especially since he's in an interim role.
If the only comment, I'll give you a quote that someone gave me, a former Speaker of the House in Massachusetts. He just reminded me that if you have the right person in the job, it's impossible to overpay them. He said, unfortunately, if you have the wrong person in the job, it's impossible to underpay them. And so, our job, as a board is to make sure that we have the right person in the job, and then also to enable him or her to have the right people in the jobs below them.
Madam Chair?
Chancellor, yes.
I was just going to say, I too, we all deal, everybody at this table and your boards deal with the issue of what's called in the parlance institutional control. That sounds like a very bureaucratic term, but at the end of the day, it actually determines whether you have an institution of high quality or whether you don't. It's no different in the private sector. It is about institutional control. And in my conversations, like the chairs with the President Robinson, members of the board, it buoys me, the fact that the definition to me of institutional control means having appropriate policies, practices, and procedures, making sure, and you mentioned this, Mr. Chair, that those are well communicated throughout the organization, vertically and horizontally. Everyone should know what the policies, practices, and procedures are at an institution, and that people then be held accountable for implementing those that they are responsible for implementing. And then lastly, is making sure you've got the people who are capable of doing that. Because if you do all those other things, and at the end of the spigot, you find that you don't have people who can accept those policies, practices, and procedures as good as they are, as well communicated as they are, and as you're going to hold people accountable to them, that's the hardest piece of the equation, is handing those off to people that you have the confidence in that they're going to be able to take those things and run with them and be held accountable for their implementation. And I think as I look at the future of Florida A&M University, I'm convinced that by working with groups like Ernst & Young, you'll do a great job of looking at best practice in the world of policies, practices, and procedures. You're going to put together a plan for, and need to, and I commend you for it, the communication of those policies, practices, and procedures once you've given them the gold seal of approval, to make sure that everybody knows what their responsibilities are and how the system works. The hardest part is always going to be in making sure that the people at the end of the day are capable in every instance of taking those policies, practices, procedures, understanding them, and carrying them out with efficiency and passion. And that's why the job of interim is always as hard as it is, because you're in a tenuous role of betwixt and between. But I am convinced, I think the people around this table are convinced, that the attitude and I'm going to tell you, for me, I don't want to speak for others, the attitude that I'm seeing at Florida A&M University really does give me a great hope that people recognize those things, people are working on those things, and people know the right thing to do and are ready to do whatever it takes to make certain that Florida A&M University's future is bright. I'll end by saying I had the great honor of having been invited by the President to the 125th anniversary celebration of Florida A&M University at the convocation, and being around a lot of people who are understanding of where they are as an institution, but more are looking for the future and recognizing that we're not there yet, but that failure here is not an option. And so we have to figure out how we're going to not only get to the future, but get there by doing all of the right things, even if the right things, and they do, sometimes hurt. So kudos, and kudos to you, Mr. President, for working with your board and understanding that through this report and others, clearly, under the aegis of institutional control, it means going back. And this is not only Florida A&M, this is all of our institutions constantly reviewing policies, practices, procedures, as mundane as they may seem to be, communicating those over and over to the point of redundancy, and then holding people accountable, all of us, for implementation. But thank you for your diligence and vigilance on this one too, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Emerson, for me, I guess I would like a little bit more. What I'd ask is that if you would work with Dr. Robinson and work with Mr. Givens, and if you would kind of go with the suggestion by Governor Kuntz and kind of look through some of the recommendations and the corrective actions that you guys have agreed to adopt, and if you would kind of put some timelines around those and then let us know what they are. I mean, I'd appreciate that. I think that the idea that if some of these are more important than others, some of them are, at least in my own mind, seem a little bit more routine, and some of them seem a bit more related to the success of the continued success of the university. So my request is that you and your committee would work with the president and work with Mr. Gibbons and come up with deadlines for when you anticipate you'll have the proposed corrective actions put in place. If you could submit that back to us, and I understand it would likely be after your next meeting, so it would be great if some of them are already done. But I think if you can do that, then that would help us to ensure that we're providing the proper oversight as well, since we're working hand in hand in ensuring the safe operation and administration of the university system. So if you would do that.
That is underway, and so we'll be very happy to share it.
I just have one other comment. A couple of meetings ago, in fact, it's been some time ago, our chair spoke with your chair in a meeting and asked whether the chair whether the board had the resources that it needed to ensure that it was providing the oversight that is expected of members of the board. And at that time, the question was actually turned over to the president, and the president responded. So it's a very different question. I thought it was one that the chair was very purposeful about asking, so it is directly to the board and given the responsibility that we're entrusting to you. Do you feel like, as a board, you have the resources that you need to ensure that you have the oversight, or that you're able to provide the oversight that is anticipated by someone holding that position?
I guess for fear of speaking on behalf of the entire board, I do, actually. Yes, and I think that the things like the fact that the board itself is requesting direct training from Ernst & Young specifically for the audit committee, sort of as one, because it's a very specialized area. Also sort of acknowledges that we see that there are certain places where, given the current state of of things, that we need to take a much more sort of active role. And I think that we are pursuing that actively.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And again, we appreciate the fact that after Sandy and losing power, that you were still able to come and be with us. And we're making sure that you get back in time for your flight. And if not, Mr. Hosseini has a very special way.
You're going to be home in time for the big nor'easter?
No, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Again, I'm sorry I could not attend the previous meeting. I was out of the country, and hopefully the nor'easter will allow me to get out tonight, but I'm not sure that I can withstand all of Mr. Hosseini's questions if I were to take him up on that invitation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda for the audit committee, actually, Mr. Harper, is just an update on where we are on the actual investigation, or several investigations, more particularly the investigation into the hazing issues related to Florida A&M. Mr. Harper.
And I will endeavor, as always, Governor Parker, to be brief. The report I want to give you on the status of the investigation is really a status update from the information provided to the board members and the members of the committee by Chancellor Brogan a couple of months ago. The primary update at this time, ma'am, is that the timetable in that particular communication to you had indicated that we would be done with the investigation on or about this time. However, because of our continued responsibilities, and just by way of context and background, in the Chancellor's update to the members of the board, he pointed out that the review of the anti-hazing program at FAMU that was undertaken by the Chancellor and then assigned to the Office of Inspector General began earlier this year. However, we were bound by 2 or 3 different circumstances to coordinate our investigation with the pending criminal investigation of the matters that occurred on November 19th of 2011. And in addition to that, there was a separate criminal investigation launched by FDLE into banned finances at the university. After gathering those documents and coordinating with FDLE, we were only able to begin active, that is, interviews, in mid to late July. And as these things always seem to turn out, with the full cooperation of the university, we are still in the midst of not only coordinating additional investigations, but also getting additional information. What I want to report to the board at this time is that we anticipate a preliminary report on the institutional internal control issues and the allegations that were made by individuals sometime within the next 2 to 3 weeks. All of the other items pointed out by Chancellor Brogan in the update continue to be true. The university will have 15 days to respond in writing. We will then make any changes to the report based upon any comments that they make, and then have a final report to the board at that time. Other than that, ma'am, we don't have any other specific developments regarding investigations that I wanted to bring to the attention of the committee at this time.
So Darian Frank, if I added that up, that would mean that by December 31, we should be done. Is that correct? I'm asking. If I added the weeks up.
No, your math is correct. You'll have, within about the next 3 weeks, the report, then taken out from there, then you begin the clock ticking for Florida A&M University to be able to respond. But you'll have the report within the next 3 weeks, but tack on some additional time for Florida A&M to respond, then you'll have their response to the report. So it comes in 2 phases. One phase being within the next 3 weeks, that report will be available to you.
And it's a 15-day response time, is that what it is?
Then on top of that will be the 15-day response time for Florida A&M, which is generally customary. But
Okay.
you'll have the report first.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
And by the way, all of that has been communicated to Dr. Robinson. So they're well aware of where we are with our report, and then what we hope they will be able to do by way of response shortly thereafter.
And Governor Parker, did you have another question? I'm sorry, I just had one.
No, go ahead.
I was
please.
just going to add, we have received full cooperation from the university in our request for information and request for interviews. And so we're proceeding apace.
Good deal.
So, I had also asked Governor Parker if I could have just a few minutes. As the Inspector General and Chief Audit Executive, and in accordance with the Audit Committee Charter, it's my responsibility to report on other activities that my office engages in. You have already received several weeks ago the Board of Governors operational audit for fiscal year 2013 conducted by the Auditor General for the state of Florida. If I could have just a few minutes to talk about the responsibilities and the activities that we engaged in. Of course, in any operational audit, it's the responsibility of the Chancellor and management to respond to any findings in the audit. You've had an opportunity to review that. That final audit report was issued in October of this year. There were 4 findings which management responded to. However, in accordance with the charter and applicable law, the Office of Inspector General appropriately acted as a liaison during this operational audit. And just a few dates. The Auditor General began with an entrance conference on this operational audit in April of this year. The fieldwork on that audit, which included a team of about 4 to 5 auditors, began on April 16th. Fieldwork didn't end until June 30th of 2012. While there was an exit conference on July 12th of 2012, the preliminary and tentative findings was not released until September, and then a revised preliminary and tentative finding report was released in late September. The management response, which included a response to the 4 findings, occurred on October 5th. the Office of Inspector General as a liaison during that particular period of time, and among other duties and activities, fielded and helped track approximately 155 different requests for information. This audit conducted by the Auditor General covered 22 topics, including the traditional areas, travel, P cards, but also information technology, fraud policy, budgeting, and oversight. The findings and recommendations, of course, of managements were submitted, and we, of course, were very happy that there were only 4 findings, and management's response has already been provided to you. In addition to that, if I may have just another few minutes, I reported to you in June that we were in the midst of completing, that is the Office of Inspector General for the Board, an ethics climate audit. We began that audit last year. We issued a preliminary and tentative finding report, which was provided to the board membership, and a final report on August 2nd of this year, right after the close of the fiscal year. Our ethics climate audit was designed to ensure that all of the ethics laws and governing authorities related to policies and procedures were in place at the board. We concluded that they were. We also concluded in that audit that the ethics climate at the board was extremely high. Based upon our review, we made one recommendation to enhance the ethics climate and also compliance with applicable statutes. We recommended that the board have a specific training module that is focused specifically on the code of ethics and also on the compliance with other Board of Governors rules and policies and procedures related to that. So, Madam Chair, that's the end of my report on some of our other activities besides investigations.
Thank you very much, Derry. Any questions for Derry? Mr. Chancellor.
Madam Chair, I don't want to take it up here because it's going to require a lengthy conversation that I think would be more appropriate when the board meets in retreat. But in at least one, maybe 2 of the 4 findings from the Auditor General, I think we had 150 requests for information, responded to all of those, and ended up with 4 findings. And it would be easy to say there, that's taken care of, and our response is all positive in terms of what we're going to do. Having said that, there seemed to be, to all of us who read the report and really digested it, and in conversation with the Auditor General's staff, there seems to be a morph in philosophy about the role that the Board of Governors, through your staff, should take with the institutions relative to all things audit. As you know, there stands the audit staff for the state university system. This is the 2nd largest state university system in the United States, and that is the staff that we have. We make it work because we put in place a system that recognizes it is impossible for us to audit all 12 of the state universities, even if we had a much larger staff than this. So we put in place a system, and it's one that I inherited from Chancellor Rosenberg, so this is not new to anybody, although Derry calls it the Brogan Doctrine, because I confirmed that I believe it's the right way to go when I got here, and that was to say it's impossible for us to audit all these moving pieces. So therefore, we need to have in place both the regulatory framework and then the oversight capability to make certain that people know what they are expected to do and that they have done it. That is the sum and substance of the Brogan Doctrine. Not very lengthy and not terribly dreamy. But at the end of the day, some of the finding discussions seem to suggest that the Board of Governors should go farther than that with some of the oversight up to and including what appears to us to be more of a direct role in the audit of these various functions and responsibilities. Now, I would tell you, there are systems who do it that way, but they are organized and staffed to do it that way. Saying it and being able to do it is a totally different issue. And so when we get to our retreat, it's something that we're going to need to talk about, because when the Auditor General is telling you you have to do this, ultimately you're going to have to respond to either say the way we are doing it is fine, it is legal, it is ethical, it is responsible, or if you believe there is merit to what they're suggesting, you have to totally reverse fields and go in a totally different direction. So we'll talk about that and lay it out for you much more clearly when we get together as we plan for the future of the state system and for the Board of Governors. But I just wanted to bring that to your attention. What they're proposing is not wrong, but it is a very different approach to that which we have wanted to do and been able to do over the past years with the Board of Governors.
So, first, thank you very much for bringing that to the Audit Committee's attention, and an opportunity for the full board to have an opportunity to hear and understand some things that may be added to the retreat agenda. And more importantly, be sure you talk to the chair about that so that he can make sure that he puts it on his agenda, because I will not be here to address that issue whenever we deal with
Once again, Mr.
with the retreat. But just ensure that the chair is comfortable with what they're proposing and how we should address it. So with that,
Ava, could I make a
yes,
comment?
yes, Governor.
You know, one of the issues, Frank, that comes up is that we're not set up to do an accounting audit. And so if we're going to expand, that means that the board staff is going to have to think about additional personnel, because that's not the function that we've employed right now. We don't have anybody on staff that could really go and do an accounting audit.
I agree, and if you stop and think, and I do, I think, Mark, I'm not trying to drag you into this, but I think you thought the same. Each university has an inspector general, each university has an office of audit and compliance, and the idea is that rather than trying to create an additional layer of redundancy, and redundancy is not a bad thing in the world of auditing, but it does require an organizational approach and a capacity to work with universities on a much larger and more intimate scale. And so, yes, sir, you are correct. If this is something that that we believe we need to do in the future, it will require not only a different structure, it will require a different staffing system in order to enable that to happen. And I'm not suggesting the board would want to go in this direction, but this conversation is prompted by some of the wording in the findings, and it's just something we need to have a conversation about. We've got great people out there in the field who, more often than not, do exactly what it is they're supposed to do. They do audit plans, they audit what they're supposed to audit, findings are checked by boards and presidents, and ultimately change is made as a result of those findings when it is warranted, and all of that is reported. So it is just something we're going to need to think about, because it is not just philosophical, it also has logistical ramifications to it.
Governor Parker, if I can clarify two things. I went through those timelines very quickly. We were conducting the ethics climate audit, that is my office, and one other staff member, at the same time that the Auditor General was there. So I wanted to, again, thank the Chancellor and all of the staff for cooperating with us, because they had two different audits going on at the same time. In particular, I'd like to point out that the recommendation we made for training, the management has already instituted a training module, and that training took place, my recollection is in September, on best practices and that kind of thing in terms of the Code of Ethics. Lastly, as in accordance with our charter and applicable law, I will conduct a 6-month follow-up on the findings in the operational audit that's required by statute, and report that to the chair and to the Legislative Auditing Committee and other designated individuals.
Thank you very much. With that, meeting is adjourned.